The two major British personal computers that launched in 1981 were the Sinclair ZX81 that I covered in the last video and the Acorn BBC Micro. The two computers couldn't be further from each other in cost, expandability, robustness, features, speed and usability. This stemmed from a fundamental disagreement on how to design a mass-market computer from colleagues turned rivals Clive Sinclair and Acorn's Chris Curry. Like Sinclair, this wasn't Acorn's first home computer, that had been the Atom. Both the ZX81 and the BBC Micro built on what came before, producing something far better. But why did the BBC Micro have so many expansion ports? Why was it ubiquitous in schools throughout the 1980s and 90s? And what part did it play in creating the CPU that's in your smartphone right now? This is the BBC Micro story. In 1981, Acorn Computers produced some interesting products, the System Range and the Atom, but neither sold in great numbers. They had rough edges, but they showed promise. The company started working on their next act, dubbed the Proton. It would use a faster 6502 processor, clocked at double the speed. But Acorn was divided on which direction it should take. Should it be a scientific workstation for labs? Should it be a business machine? Or should it be something else? They were still deciding when development took an unexpected turn. The UK government and the British public had been shocked by the TV programmes that told of an oncoming computer wave that would change the whole fabric of society. Britain wasn't prepared and the government wanted to do something about it. So the Computer Literacy Project was born, a broad undertaking to not only help people learn about computers, but get over the anxiety of this digital age that was coming for their jobs. There'd be a series of TV programs to show how computers worked. To support this, the team decided they needed a computer to demonstrate computing concepts, and viewers could purchase the machine for themselves. The new brain was being developed with government backing. Given its close links to the state, the computer literacy team's requirements were written with this in mind. By spring of 1980, a list had been formulated that included high-resolution graphics, robustness, and support for disk drives and printers. The company making the new brain had previously employed Clive Sinclair and Chris Curry of Acorn Computers, and not surprisingly, both men got wind of the government's plans. They correctly surmised that even though the government didn't want a computer maker making colossal profits by being the preferred microcomputer, there was still a lot of money to be made by being chosen. After all, with the government's backing, it was likely to sell in large numbers. Both companies demanded that they be given a chance to bid. Clive Sinclair pitched the ZX81. It might not come close to the government's requirements, but Sinclair pointed out that it was affordable, a key requirement for a machine that was going to educate the masses. Acorn had the Proton, but it wasn't much more than a series of ideas. Acorn were given the chance to show their machine in a week's time. All they needed to do now was build the machine that they pitched. So started a fevered week of work at Acorn, producing not just the hardware but also the software. The new machine used a new 2 MHz 6502 processor, and the team wanted to use the latest 4 MHz memory chips. There was none to be found in the UK, so some were hand-carried through customs by Hitachi of Europe 2 days before the Proton was to be demonstrated. Amazingly, in 1 week the Acorn team managed to create a computer that showed what the BBC Micro could be. The concept was just that, it was a concept and could only do a fraction of what the final BBC Micro was able to do. But it proved to the computer literacy team that the Proton wouldn't only meet their requirements, but would exceed them. Acorn signed an agreement to produce a machine to be known as the BBC Micro in February 1981. Acorn was jubilant, and Clive Sinclair was left stamping on his hat in frustration. Part of the computer literacy team's requirements had been the ability to run CP/M, a popular operating system. That meant it needed a Z80 processor, which wasn't a problem for the new brain, but Acorn's machines used the 6502, which at that time couldn't run CP/M. The team's solution was to pitch what they called the tube interface, a port that allowed you to add a second processor, like a Z80 for example, to allow it to run CP/M. But CP/M's popularity would quickly wane and very few second processor peripherals would be built, let alone used. But this feature, really a concession to get the contract, would turn out to have far-reaching consequences for Acorn and for the world. The computer literacy project would ideally want to have a standardized BASIC, but whilst Microsoft BASIC had been popular in American micros, in the UK there was no clear leader. Given that, the computer literacy team outlined standards that they wanted Acorn's BASIC to meet. It needed to have a good deal in common with existing BASIC implementations. It should be well designed, structured, whatever that meant, and should encourage good coding practices. So a solid but quirky Acorn Atom BASIC evolved into something more standard. It also became a lot more powerful, supporting the BBC Micro's new features and expansion opportunities. BASIC on many computers actively encouraged unstructured code, which quickly turned into an unmanageable rat's nest as programs grew. Whilst you could still get yourself into a lot of trouble with the goto command in Acorn BBC BASIC, you could also use features like procedure calls with parameters, which produced code that was easy to read and maintain. A faster 6502 and 4 MHz memory meant BASIC was fast as well. Compare the bouncing ball routine on the VIC-20 and the BBC Micro. Both computers used a 6502, but the BBC had next generation speed. More features meant more ROM space. In 1977, ROM chips were really expensive, so Tandy did all they could to fit the TRS-80 BASIC into 4 kilobytes. But by 1981, Acorn could afford to use two 16KB ROM chips, one for the BASIC and one for the operating system. And this ROM size allowed for arguably the most complete and useful version of BASIC of any machine up to this point. One option the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, considered important was the ability to receive telesoftware over the TV signal through the teletext service. This was going to be the future of how you got software. Fortunately, Acorn had experience using the teletext chip. It had been an option on their system computer, so adding the chip to the BBC Micro wasn't too difficult. It had the advantage that as a display mode it only used 1 kilobyte of the computer's precious memory, which made it ideal for text programs with light graphics. Acorn would produce an optional teletext decoder box eventually to display teletext and download telesoftware, although with a compressed time schedule to get the computer released, this would have to come later. Software design took a long time, but the hardware wasn't without its challenges either. Like the ZX81, the BBC used an uncommitted logic array or ULA chip to reduce the chip count. Acorn decided to use more gates than the manufacturer recommendation, thinking that they could get away with it. The first batch of 8 all worked, which gave them confidence. However, those 8 were clearly outliers because when the ULAs were produced at scale, the success rate was just 5%. More work was needed. There were other parts of the system that didn't require solutions right away, but needed provisioning for the future, such as support for speech synthesis and floppy disk drives. The team allowed for additional ROMs to be added to add these features later, when they had the time to create them. The team never got to the bottom of some of the system's gremlins. The board in one instance wouldn't run, but Steve Ferber, one of the developers, discovered that if he put his finger on the board in just the right place, it magically started working. His finger was acting as a crude resistor, so adding a resistor pack solved the issue, but the team never understood why it was needed. Expandability was in Acorn's DNA since the 1979 system line, and both the Computer Literacy Project team and the BBC were keen the computer should be as flexible as possible. So as well as the tube interface for an additional CPU, there was an RS423 serial port, a cassette port, analog input port that could be used for joysticks, an Econet networking port, a user port with 8 programmable digital lines, a 1 MHz bus port that connected to the address bus, a printer connector and a disk drive port. Expandability also applied to video output. The BBC Micro could be connected to a TV, but there was also composite and RGB component out, something not common at the time given the rarity of RGB component colour monitors. It was included because the BBC wanted a broadcast quality picture for their TV programmes. but it also came in handy when high-quality colour monitors started appearing. The computer offered 8 video modes. Mode 7 was the teletext video mode, and modes 0 to 6 offered varying resolutions and colour combinations. As the video memory was shared with program memory, this allowed the user to make a trade-off between graphics and program space. The highest resolution graphics offered a quite remarkable 640 by 256 resolution. A popular mode for games offered 8 colours but only 160 by 256 graphics and consumed a massive 20 kilobytes of the 32 kilobytes of memory. Sound was provided by the same chip used in the Texas Instruments TI-99/4 and would be used for many other machines, including the Sega Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis. It was also used in arcade cabinets including Mr. Do, which explains why the sound for the BBC Micro clone Mr. E, Mystery, get it, was so good.
You may have noticed 1982 is Information Technology Year. There's a Minister of Information Technology, and the government is even spending a great deal of money on publicising it. But what is information technology?
The computer literacy team had BBC TV education programmes lined up for 1981, but Acorn couldn't meet that deadline. TV programmes were delayed until 1982, but even then presenters had to rely on unstable pre-production machines. Such were the problems, hosts faked typing on real computers when they were really using large development machines sitting underneath the desk. Acorn worked hard to get the BBC Micro launched in December 1981. No one knew how much demand there would be, so a minimum production of 12,000 was agreed. But the TV programmes served as free advertising, and Acorn was swamped with orders. The entire 12,000 initial production run were ordered just a month after the machine launched. Acorn had never before had to deal with large-scale production. The Atom hadn't exactly flown off the shelves. Early on, production problems plagued the BBC Micro. In January 1982, only 1,000 machines were produced, but it quickly ramped up. By March, 5,000 left British factories, but with 20,000 orders by April, it meant customers had to wait months to get their new BBC Micro. A key problem was the power supply. The BBC wanted Acorn to use a linear power supply. These were tried and tested technology, but they ran too hot. Too hot for the BBC Micro's case, in any case, causing quality problems that meant production was so low. Acorn wanted to use a switch mode power supply that was cooler, but to the BBC this was new experimental technology. Eventually the BBC relented and the BBC Micro got a switch mode supply, the same design that's used in electronics to this day. The goal had been to create a machine for under £200, but when it launched, the BBC Micro was sold for £225 as the Model A and £325 for the Model B. A cheaper Model A had 16 kilobytes of RAM to the Model B's 32 kilobytes and lacked many of the expansion ports. The hardware was still there, just the ports were missing, which meant customers handy with a soldering iron and 16 kilobytes of RAM could save themselves a bit of money. And that was worth it because only 16 kilobytes of memory meant some of the best video display modes were unavailable. Acorn badly anticipated costs and quickly raised the prices of both machines to £299 and £399. Despite this, most customers though were happy to spend more for the Model B. This might be a computer to educate the masses, but it certainly wasn't the price the masses could afford thanks to the long spec sheet from the BBC and the Computer Literacy Project team. For the price of a BBC Model B, inflation adjusted, today you can buy a MacBook, an iPad, an Apple Watch, an Apple TV and a set of AirPods. But that higher price meant Acorn could make a profit on every machine, and they got a boost when the government decided to offer machines to secondary schools at a discount. This was a machine to educate, so there was maybe more importance put on getting the user guide right than any machine before it. It was needed to explain how to use a computer and how to program in BASIC to complete novices, but also those who were moving from other computers. With a short production timeline, the first 25,000 users got a provisional version of the user guide with a final version coming later. Acorn also included a welcome tape with 16 programs that demonstrated what could be done with the computer, things like sorting algorithms, databases, and so much more. There were even a couple of simple games, plus a program highlighting biorhythms. Biorhythms were a pseudoscience that don't survive scientific scrutiny, but nevertheless seemed to be all the rage in the early 1980s. Acorn had a fledgling software house, Acornsoft, that had produced some games for the Atom. With the BBC Micro's speed, excellent 4-channel sound chip and colour high-resolution graphics, they produced surprisingly faithful conversions of early 1980s arcade hits. Our family had a Beeb, and here's some of the games that we were personally addicted to. Rocket Raid is a clone of the Scramble arcade hit and one of the few games that I've actually managed to complete. Snapper is a very good Pac-Man clone which had to be reworked so Acorn wouldn't be sued. There's Mr. E that I've already mentioned, but our family also loved Painter from A&F Software, the people that made Chucky Egg. Many a night our house would ring out to the fart sounds that you got every time you filled a block. Like many, we loaded these games from cassette tape. We never got one, but soon a 5 1/4-inch disk drive was available using a new ROM chip that added disk support. ROMs could be inserted into several blank sockets on the circuit board to expand the capabilities of this already capable machine. Talking of ROMs, the BBC came with a perforated part to the left of the keyboard. Underneath was a ROM socket that allowed an expansion chip to be more easily installed without taking the computer apart. I can't have been the only person who was sorely tempted to pop the perforations. I mean, it was just so tempting. But you knew that once you popped, you could stop, but the BBC would be disfigured for life. Throughout 1982, production problems were resolved and the BBC Micro, or the Beeb as it was affectionately known, got into the public's hands. More good news came Acorn's way. The government's BBC Micro discount scheme was extended to primary schools. By 1985, 80% of British schools would have at least one of Acorn's newest Micro. Acorn had been developing Econet networking before the BBC Micro. It had been available for the Atom. The circuitry wasn't included on a standard BBC Micro, but could be added along with a connector. The ability to network a BBC made it ideal for school group classwork, with many machines tied to an expensive disk drive. The teletext adapter arrived, allowing telesoftware to be downloaded from the TV signal, but it was expensive and not many were sold. Likewise, there was a Prestel adapter that connected the BBC Micro via telephone to the major British bulletin board service. Primary kids were introduced to coding with the Logo language, controlling a turtle plotter that drew the commands that you gave it. For those more adventurous, the wealth of ports meant you could attach sensors and use BASIC to monitor and control them, or use the inline assembler to learn machine code. A generation of software engineers and electrical engineers learnt their trade with the BBC Micro. All this focus on education, both the public education and schools, meant the BBC got rather forgotten as a business computer, even though features like 80-column support and high-resolution monitor support would have worked well for word processing and spreadsheets, as it had with the Apple II. But whilst 32 kilobytes looked like a lot of memory for a home computer in 1981, it was small potatoes when the IBM PC caught on. After all, any 80-column spreadsheet app only had 12 kilobytes to run, with 20 kilobytes going on video memory, and that needed to hold both the program and the spreadsheet data. Maybe stick to 40-column teletext mode and have the luxury of 31 kilobytes. The business market started to gravitate towards a machine from a computer company that was known for business. After all, it was there in the name. More free advertising came in 1983 with another BBC TV show, Making the Most of the Micro, which featured the BBC Micro heavily, using it to explain just what the computer could do. Clive Sinclair would have been angry indeed if his ZX Spectrum wasn't selling so well. It might seem that the government deal was free money for Acorn, but the deal was symbiotic. The Computer Literacy Project was greatly enhanced by having a machine as good as the BBC Micro to teach people first principles, and it was of course excellent in schools. Many kids' first experience with a computer in the 1980s and into the 90s was with a BBC Micro, and its easy to use basic and robust computer meant they were great for schools. And with BBC computers in the BBC TV Centre, it was natural that it would be used to help create TV shows with graphical effects that might look pretty naff now, but were innovative for the time. The BBC was full-featured but expensive, especially against machines like the 1982 ZX Spectrum that cost half the price and had more memory. Acorn's Chris Curry wanted to take on his work colleague turned rival Clive Sinclair, and so designed a cut-price version of the BBC Micro, the Acorn Electron. It would be something to not only replace the Model A, but to eclipse it in price. Many sacrifices were made to get the computer's cost down. That and delays meant it didn't stack up well against the competition like the Commodore 64. Independent TV channels hadn't done much with the computer literacy project, probably because these TV shows would have had trouble finding advertisers and so wouldn't have made money. But the commercial success of the BBC Micro had them thinking of making an ITV Micro. There was money to be made selling computers. Talks began with Trans Am computers to make something that ran CP/M. It would be a cost-reduced version of the Trans Am Tuscan, selling for £399, the same price as the BBC Model B, but with 64 kilobytes of RAM and a disk interface. But the project immediately hit the rocks. Some independent TV companies thought this would run afoul of product sponsorship rules, and there was opposition to showing the educational content, which was unlikely to pay for itself in advertising revenue. The project ended as quickly as it had begun. The BBC TV shows were not only shown in the UK, but they were also shown abroad. Acorn highlighted the US and West Germany as good markets to expand into and made a big push. At one point, there were over 1,000 dealerships stateside. But despite trying to crack the educational market, competition with the Apple II and now the head-turning Macintosh meant the BBC failed to make traction. Selling in the West German market meant some changes. My Swiss cheese memory recalled that the BBC Micro had to be renamed as the British Broadcasting Corporation Microcomputer System, that just trips off the tongue, because of the Bavarian Bovril Company, or BBC, thought there would be confusion. I was right that the name needed to be changed, but it was the Brown, Bavary and C electrical firm, whatever they're called. They don't exist anymore, it doesn't matter what they were called. Anyway, that makes way more sense, as I'm sure Bovril wasn't a massive thing in Bavaria. Acorn Soft made some excellent arcade ports, but in 1984 they published one of the best games of the 20th century, I don't say that lightly, Elite. This was a 3D space shooter inspired by the Atari game Star Raiders, but there was so much more to it. It involved trading, 3D wireframe space battles, lots of trouble docking, and provided an endless number of planets to visit. Elite started a whole new genre and was ported to many different systems. There were sequels such as Elite Dangerous in 2014, and like Star Raiders with the Atari 400 and 800, it surely managed to shift a few BBC Micros as well. No wonder then that by 1984 Acorn was producing 40,000 machines a month. Given how complex the BBC was to produce, it's not a surprise that there were far more clones of the ZX81, but there were at least 2 clones produced with the blessing of Acorn computers. Indian manufacturers sold the SCL Unicorn and Hope Computer Dolphin in limited quantities in an attempt to kickstart the Indian software development community, just like the BBC was doing back in Britain. Since the BBC launched, RAM prices continued to fall, and more modern and cheaper computers offered more for less. 12 kilobytes of program memory in the highest resolution mode was just too little to do anything meaningful. To keep sales going, Acorn launched the BBC B Plus 64 and B Plus 128 in 1985. It was too little too late when compared to the competition and introduced compatibility issues with some original BBC programmes. A more substantial change came a year later in 1986, the BBC Master. The most obvious change was a numeric keypad. There were also 2 cartridge slots and a slightly faster processor plus 128 kilobytes of RAM. By this time, the basic ROM and user interface had grown into a sophisticated operating system. It kept selling into schools, but didn't worry the home computer market. Those customers were looking for the much more capable 16-bit Atari ST and Commodore Amiga. The Master could interface with a Philips video disc player, and this combination produced a 1980s multimedia computer way ahead of the CDI and the CD-ROM PCs of the 1990s. I remember doing a training course on one at a bank during work experience in the late 1980s. I think they were trying to babysit me, and it was of course used to great effect for the BBC Doomsday Project, an undertaking to chart the UK in the mid-1980s, 900 years after the original Doomsday Project that inventoried England for William the Conqueror. Vince Clarke of Erasure also used the BBC to create music, and it featured in some of their music videos. Despite railing against synthesizers in the 1970s, Queen used the BBC Micro to sequence their album A Kind of Magic. Now, remember that second processor tube interface that Acorn had to add to support the Z80 processor so it could run CP/M? Well, they did create the Z80 second processor and a few people bought it, but it led to something much more important. The team who developed the BBC Micro used it to test various other CPUs and discovered that those with a smaller instruction set used less power per cycle. They visited a semiconductor maker in Arizona. Being the USA, they thought it would be a big multinational housed in a gleaming building. Instead, they found what they described as a bunch of people working out of a bungalow in the Phoenix suburbs. If CPU design could be done with such a small team and few resources, then why couldn't Acorn make their own chip? And so, like Deep Thought designed its computing successor in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Acorn used the BBC to create the next machine that would dwarf its power, the Acorn Archimedes, that used the first production ARM CPU, a chip that's become the default CPU for every tablet and smartphone in the world. There were plenty of schools that were still running a lab full of BBC Micros and wanted to buy replacements. I was learning assembly language programming at university on a BBC Micro in the 1990s. The Archimedes might have launched in 1987, but the BBC Micro range continued in production for another 7 years. Production ended in 1994 with 1.5 million Beebs produced. After production ended, there was still a lot of love for the Beeb. J.G. Harston managed to bring the old rivals together in 2002 when he managed to get BBC Basic running on a ZX Spectrum. Finally, Specky users had the structure of BBC Basic. There were even new games like Infinite Porridge in 2024, a Wallace & Gromit Defender clone by my friend Alec Barker. Instead of shooting lasers, this game embraced the Beeb's British roots, shooting porridge to save the day. The Raspberry Pi project has been highly successful, and its team have cited the BBC Micro as an influence. It's no coincidence that you can buy a Pi Model A and a Pi Model B. It can't be underestimated how much Acorn's and Sinclair's machines did to bring Britain into the age of the personal computer. Acorn's BBC Micro was there in schools, showing kids how to use a keyboard, a disk drive, and yes, how to program. That helped a nation more easily adopt computers in businesses that vastly increased productivity, the magic sauce that makes nations richer. The government's computer literacy project had done its job. Sinclair's machines were affordable for the home and helped kids and adults learn how to use computers, to program, and all about games. Even this was helpful, as it produced an army of game developers that allowed Britain to punch above its weight in the global computer games business. The BBC Micro launched at the end of 1981. In the next video, we move into 1982. The next major European home computer to arrive was the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. This is a faithful reproduction of it. The story of this little machine will come right after we take a short diversion to Australia to see what was going on there with the all-Australian Micro B. If you want more BBC content, I'd highly recommend Colin Hode's channel, and I've linked to one of his videos on the right. When the Micro B or ZX Spectrum video is done, I'll link to one of them as well. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.